Welcome back to Pro-Life University, folks. Here's your professor, Joe Kral, President of the Society of St. Sebastian, and welcome to our second class for the semester. Today we're going to talk a little bit, something that we could say is a little bit more controversial within pro-life circles, and maybe even obviously outside pro-life circles too. We're going to talk a little bit about in vitro fertilization, or IVF for short, and we're going to talk about why many things that happen with respect to IVF are indeed pro-life issues, and that we need to look at legislation that in many ways begins to regulate and limit the various harms that IVF has put forward. Let me first simply say this, and let me start with this. I know some folks out there, when they look at IVF, they just merely see the end result, which is a child. So on the surface, it looks like it's something that is pro-life because it's meant to obviously have a couple have a baby. And in many respects, people seem to look at that and they go, oh, wow, this is something that's generating life, and that's a good. And that's in their mindset. But in reality, what we have with respect to in vitro fertilization, or IVF, or the IVF industry, is really a wolf in sheep's clothing. In many respects, we don't look at the very real nitty-gritty details that goes into IVF. And so I want to explore a little bit about that today, and we're going to explore a little bit more about one possible type of legislation that could definitely limit the harm obviously through pro-life incrementalism. So let me simply start off by saying this. When someone goes in to have in vitro fertilization, it's not just one embryo that is created for a couple. It's many embryos that are created for a couple. And as a result, many of those embryos can end up either being perpetually frozen, which is obviously human rights abuse. We shouldn't freeze human beings, especially not freeze them perpetually. But furthermore, many of those embryos are destroyed because they may not make the cut according to the researchers, or not so much the researchers, but the clinician standards. And so as a result, it obviously becomes a pro-life issue. And this is something that we really, as a pro-life movement, need to dive into. We need to help protect these embryonic children from abuse, from either being destroyed or even frozen perpetually. And this is something that we need to engage in. Now, one of the pieces legislation I want to look at today deals with informed consent regarding egg donation. Now, one of the things that we typically know when it comes to egg donors, right? It's not always altruistic, people going out there and donating their eggs. The vast majority of these women are paid. And one of the things that we do know is that they tend to target women, especially those women who are in college and may be facing debt or have to, obviously pay for school and whatnot. And they tend to target these types of women. So women that may be in financial straits are typically targeted for egg donation. We know that in many ways, while they do receive a form of informed consent, the question really becomes, both legally and morally, in essence, is it true informed consent? Is it up to the standards that it really needs to be? In some respects, obviously the IVF industry would argue, oh, sure, yeah, well, no doubt, this is great informed consent. These are great informed consent standards. I think us from a pro-life perspective would certainly argue, no, they are woefully insufficient. Right? In many respects, I think, especially when it comes to egg donation, we've got to look at the type of informed consent that we pass with respect to abortion as well. We're very keen on providing her information, especially on fetal development. Obviously, what are the risks that are involved and so forth. And it's in a manual, and then she has to digest that information for in most states for at least 24 hours. In some states, it's up to 72 hours before she finally says okay. Right? And obviously the hope with informed consent legislation when it comes to abortion is that she learns enough information, especially about the humanity of the unborn child, or enough information that, abortion isn't as safe as the abortion industry makes it out to be. That simply put, that this information will help change your mind. And again, to some extent, we may need to look at this sort of thing when it comes to in vitro fertilization as well. Let me first and foremost say this. One of the things that the IVF industry is very keen on is trying to define, these gamete cells, the human egg cell, as a form of property. And I think we've got to be very clear here. There's something that's very unique about the human egg cell and the human sperm cell for that matter as well. That it's not just property along the lines of a piece of furniture or a house or a car. Those certainly have their own purposes. But there's something quite unique, metaphysically speaking, about the human ovum. And in particular, that its sole purpose is there to create a new human life when it's joined with the, opposite human sperm. So when an egg cell meets a sperm cell, those two gamete cells come together, they join together, and they create a new human life. So the purpose of an egg cell, obviously, is to join with the sperm cell in order to create new life. In many respects, we have to understand it, and this obviously gets into a theology of the body here. And I don't obviously have a lot of time to get into that, but I would certainly recommend if you do become interested. There's a great amount of theology out there. John Paul II has obviously written, he's really kind of the author of the idea of the theology of the body. So there's a whole plethora of information that he's written about in homilies, Wednesday homilies, books, so forth. Christopher West is also well known for his interpretation of John Paul II's theology of the body and so forth. So, there's plenty of authors that people can go out and look and dive into this. But the idea is this, is that the human egg, in many respects, is not so much property as much as it is a gift, if you will, really a gift of the wife's genetic self to her husband. She's literally allowing this egg to be presented as a gift, and her husband's sperm in many ways is a gift to her. So this is one of the reasons why we talk about the openness of life within the Catholic Church. And this obviously gets into the problem of IVF as well, and why the Catholic Church is not in favor of it. But again, that's another topic for another day. So let's talk about this. So, again, here we have a woman that's presenting something that's definitely unique. It's certainly, from a moral perspective, not property, and it's certainly not property along the lines of, say, a car, a house, or anything else, like I just said. But it's something unique because it's meant to create a biological child. Now, does the woman have a moral interest in what happens to her biological child? Well, of course. I mean, we see this all the time. Obviously, people are concerned about their own biological children. We've grown as a society, for the most part, to this very day, to where we even do open adoptions now. That is the norm, where the biological mother basically has the choice to see which family that her child can be placed with. She has the choice to say, well, I prefer this family over this family. And so, again, here in this sort of case, I mean, obviously it's not quite the same, but it's probably the most similar. We can see the need for the biological mother to have proper information. So what she should be informed about? Well, there's obviously the risks that are involved in this particular procedure. Hyperovulation or superovulation, those are the terms that talk about this thing, certainly contains risks, because when we talk about a woman donating her egg, she's not donating just one egg. The IVF industry gives her hormones that cause her ovaries to hyperovulate or superovulate, to where she's not just releasing one egg, but she's releasing a lot of eggs. Anywhere from maybe 4. In some cases, you've heard of upwards of 10 or more. And so this causes a lot of stress, obviously, on the ovary. And so there's certain risks that are associated with that. So obviously one of the things that she ought to be informed of is the risk, and maybe even diagrams that explain what's happening with this procedure and so forth. But I would even venture a little bit further, because we are talking about her biological child here. And so she ought to be informed that that it's more likely than not, in many cases, that many of her biological children will not, obviously become children, either because they die after they're, transferred into the uterus, or they're perpetually frozen, or these embryonic children are destroyed because they don't make the grade according, to the clinic technicians and the doctors. And so she ought to be given that sort of information as well. She may have a concern that, hey, I want all my biological children to be given a chance to live and to be implanted and so forth. But furthermore, what's interesting to note here is that she also ought to be informed that there may be cases in which, her child may be aborted. And she ought to be given information about that as well. What's going on with the abortion, what types of abortion procedures are there. She ought to be given information, in my opinion, about fetal development, if that's the case as well. She has a legitimate interest in knowing everything that's going to happen to her biological child. In many respects, she has less say in what happens to her biological child than a mother who's giving up her child for adoption. Obviously, if a mother is giving up her child for adoption, she has a lot more say about where the child can go and so forth. And so in many respects, I think proper informed consent with respect to, egg donation can definitely help reduce, because I think there are women out there that simply would not want to donate if they find out that their child can be destroyed because it doesn't meet the genetic criteria of clinic technicians, or that their child may even be aborted. They may be absolutely appalled along those lines. And so in many respects, I think this might actually cause people to sit back and think and go, wow, do I want this to happen to my biological child? And I think there are women out there that would simply say, well, no, I don't. I don't want this to happen to my biological child. There's a whole plethora of legislative initiatives that pro-life groups could look into. So, for example, one of the things that we can also talk about in the future is, for example, how many embryos can be created during this process, so as to limit the amount of children that are destroyed, or limit the amount that are frozen, begin limiting those sorts of things as well. In many ways, we got to understand IVF, as I said just a moment ago, is really a wolf in sheep's clothing. It cloaks itself in this idea that, well, look, we produce children for these infertile couples. But in many respects, it's a big problem, because many children are destroyed as well. And so we as pro-lifers ought to be very, very concerned about this sort of thing. Now, while we certainly need to be sensitive to people who are suffering from infertility, I think we also need to keep in mind we can't justify our sensitivity or our silence when children are being destroyed, either through selective reduction or through the process of just the embryonic child being destroyed, just simply because it doesn't meet the genetic grade, so to speak. So we need to really focus on many ways, and we need to ask ourselves as pro-life organizations and advocates and so forth, what can we do this year in 2020 that can help limit the evil of the in vitro fertilization industry, especially when it comes to destroying embryonic children. I appreciate everything that y'all do for us. I always appreciate you watching these videos. Again, always give us a big thumbs up. You share with your friends. I mean, we need to get the word out, obviously. I hope you all have a blessed weekend, and God bless.